So I'd love to conclude with the words of Suleiman Bashi Diagne, and I think this question of storylines as well. He considers in his book in African Art as Philosophy, the writing of Leopold Senghor on art, from the perspective of being also a cultural and political leader, approaches African art as metaphysics of rhythm, where being in rhythm is an ordering force. And I think there's something there, there's some power in that mode of thinking, because it counters linearity and this foreclosed nature of canons within the cultural world as well. It also allows us a productive negotiation with the critique on universal museums towards a pluralist narrative capacity for cyclical flows and counterpoints. Also going back to Ariella Azoulay, who wrote, From Potential History, which I was also citing at the day one of the Experimenter Curators Hub. Azoulay writes in a rather provocative and urgent address, potential history refuses to inhabit the position of the historian who arrives after the events are over. That is, after the violence was made into part of the sealed past, disassociated in time and space from where we are. Violence against people and their worlds is not history, and the work of potential history is to argue that this violence can be reversed, brought to a closure, mended. I think there are presentations of Nama Nahuja, Sasha Kola, Naomi Beckwith, that in particular, through their own navigation of the curatorial field, spoke to this, as well as Rux in a sense as well. Kojo Eshun, artist from the Autolith group and cultural critic, said in a lecture called Narratives of a Near Future at the Art School Head in Geneva. He shared critiques of the term Afrofuturism, and I'm just citing this because it feels as though, if we consider Arundhati Roy's writing on pandemic as portal, pandemic as rupture, how do we then still negotiate with the condition of futurity? And futurity as this way that Luli talked about of a kind of a collective response to building futures that are common futures, and how to use the various vocabularies in the room to do so without, once again, creating this hierarchy of humaneness. And so Eshun, while considering the various criticisms of, say, the term Afrofuturism, but this could also apply to other forms of futurism, he says that the term might be excluding of those practices that stem from the African continent, South America, and the Caribbean, becoming more Anglo and America-centric. It might enclose globally enclose Blackness. It is insufficiently tuned to the afterlife of slavery, as Sadiya Hartman might say. What is a yearning or desire to imagine Blackness in the near and far future, putting pressure and disenchantment on futurity as inscribed in racialized capitalism? How to bring forth an insurgent futurism, interrupted and discontinuous tendencies of time through the Black radical tradition. He then says, it is not so much a matter of whether slavery follows from racism or whether racism follows from slavery. It is not so much a matter of what Afrofuturism will do with the future. It is a matter of what the future is doing with the human as an unfinished project. More precisely, it is a matter of what temporality or contingency does with race, understood as a continually reformatted division within the human species. It is a matter of an appreciation of what the future does to and with and from race, understood as an intra-human technology. This is a mouthful, but I felt there's a lot in there that we could glean for ourselves, for our various practices, to think about what Eshun and various colleagues he has cited consider as an insurgent futurism, and what Azuleh considers a practice of potential history. In the last chapter of The Origins of Totalitarianism, loneliness, Hannah Arendt posits, is the defining condition of totalitarianism and the common ground of all terror. Isolation and solitude flank loneliness as two related but distinct conditions. Isolation, she writes, might be the beginning of terror. It certainly is its most fertile ground. It always is its result. Therefore, what do we do with the condition of forced isolation and continuing to rub against it, to move into communitarian formats of life at this point in time? And I've been thinking, as this word care continues to come up, about our own lexicon in our various languages from various parts of India and various parts of the world, how this term care can be deeply acknowledged and reckoned with in various ways. I mean, if one just kind of zooms out and thinks about, the words that come to one's mind from home, care could be dhyan, dekh-rekh, dekhbhal, parva, raksha, seva, chinta, zimedari. There's so many formations that one could link into to think about this condition of care, but also of intimacy as atmiyata, which again has so many formulations that we could tap into. In his text, Learning from the Virus for Art Forum, Paul Preciado reminds us, it is precisely because our bodies are the new enclaves of biopower, and because our apartments are the new cells of biovigilance, that it is more urgent than ever to invent new strategies of cognitive emancipation and resistance. But also, he opens up for us the word immunity and where it originates, or one of its points of origin, stating the noun immunitas is a privative word that stems from the negation of munus, that is tax, tribute, gift. In Roman law, immunity was a privilege that released someone from the obligations shared by all. He who had been exempted was immunized. He who had been deimmunized, conversely, had been stripped of all community privileges after having been deemed a threat to the community. So here I would end on thinking through how we might face the terms of alienation, but also rethink the question of immunity as a productive goal, and at the same time, to move away from the fear of what is foreign in us and around us. Thank you so much for an extremely inspiring set of presentations and dialogues. We're now going to move into the group conversation and take up the various questions that are among audiences. And please feel free to, ask any of the curators questions that are on your mind from what they have shared with us. And I also have my own, but I'm going to wait to see if there are questions from the audience, or also from the other panelists to each other. if you prefer to speak and ask your question through audio or also with your video, please raise your hand or request for unmute.
If you keep your hand raised, the experimenter team will put you on audio video as per your request.
Are we all supposed to be on video? What's the deal?
Yes, please. For the presenters, it would be great if that's fine with you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, if it's in the interest of dialogue, then I would be really curious, just from a sort of a completely personal, for personal reasons, if Rohit could perhaps elaborate on this aspect of sort of identity politics in relation to what I just presented. I'm genuinely curious.
Okay, you're putting me on the spot. Yes. It was not meant to be a critique. It was actually meant to be a critic.
Oh no, it's not. I'm just curious as to what exactly, what made you think of that. I mean, like I said, it could be your perspective, and that's It
wasn't so much a perspective. It was more just like observing, but
okay,
something for the organizers, because they put the two presentations together, and it seemed like.
Right. Acha. Okay. ठीक है.
Okay.
Okay, you're off the hook.
Question already? Okay. Okay, good.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question in the meanwhile. If some of you would like to think back to, I mean, because we're also kind of revisiting a decade in a sense, at least for the Curators Hub. If there is a specific project or practice that for you has come to the fore or gained primacy at this time, also with Naomi, when visiting Homebodies, felt like there could almost be a sort of free reading of where that project can be, considered within our current time. And there was a question also about the long dream from one of the audience members to ask if it's a project that's been made today, how much time it took and whether it's brought together research on the Chicago art scene from a number of years, or if it's really very much from the current time.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit about the long dream. First of all, hello, everyone. And just a note to say that I have really, really enjoyed this time and how important it is to have this kind of communal moment, even if virtually. And thank Natasha, as always, for her incredibly prescient sort of elucidations of these moments. It's been really enriching. Going back to the long dream in particular, it actually was a project that came together rather quickly. We, like many museums around the world, especially in the States, had to reconfigure our entire exhibition calendar because so many shows couldn't travel anymore because things started moving around. And so instead of going dark, as it were, we decided to do this show. The question of time is an interesting one because I can say that the pragmatic logistics around putting the show together happened in probably 5 months. But really, that 5 months was an aggregate of all the work that people across the division of the museum that I work in had been doing with Chicago artists for years. And so it felt as if these relationships, conversations, these engagement with artists had kind of been saturated into this moment. So as I said before, it was a show that didn't have a single curatorial voice. But what it did was enabled everyone within that division to say, these are the artists that are thinking through the themes that we are putting forth right now as a kind of first historical pass, if you will, at the moment we're in as a moment of reflection. And I would also just lastly say too, that it is not only just thinking about this moment that's been shaped by COVID, but it was also trying to imagine what to do with the long history in Chicago of artists doing these relational practices and thinking about social justice. There are plenty of artists for whom activism is integral in their practice. And so in trying to, again, imagine these different futures, there's a whole section of the show called Lucid Dreaming, which is exactly about that. It was a way to capture that energy and those concerns in Chicago as a locality.
Okay. Would anyone else like to take up that question to sort of share of a project or practice that specifically for you has gained a kind of vital role in your thinking, or is shaping, is even providing some, sense of comfort at this time for you, or that you're reinvestigating?
I'll say something quickly that I think 10 years ago, I was not that invested in moving image and video art. And particularly as I haven't been able to return to Canada, where my postdoc is, or to Samoa, where my family is, during the pandemic, that the importance of digital files being able to be accessed on Vimeo channels and other platforms with the right kind of context has become really significant to me and to people I'm connected with in terms of maintaining a sense of cultural integrity and moving forward in some direction, but also remembering who we are and where we're going. Very brief.
Okay. Also wondering, yesterday, one of our audience members, I think it was Arani Bose, brought up the question of interstitial cultural organizations or interstitial cultural models, and perhaps their role in the coming time. And I was wondering if any of you would like to perhaps share how you might have participated or observed, from your arts community, productive models that might be also ways to think again beyond the sort of universal museum or the Kunsthalle, etc., or places from where the community arts center takes preeminence. But what kind of interstitial cultural models can we sort of think through and imagine or share as examples for the time that we're in?
I can say one thing that it's a bit tricky to model the interstitial. I'll give an example because it is between artist and a certain context of student that something emerges. Like I will give an example. The JNU has a very beautiful space where Gitanjali has shown, and everybody in Delhi would know. But when there is a curatorial course, the space gets animated. Like when we did a curatorial course in 2016, we used the space as a studio space to do the course, and then it became transformed into an exhibition, primarily a performative space. But what is interesting is that space by itself doesn't get a narration to become that. It gets used, it gets produced as a space. So in the sense that the brass tacks are there, but it needs an imagination of an artistic practice that has to translate it into a space. So the students could translate it into a studio and then into a space. Little cajoling was needed, a little bit of discussion of what is an exhibitionary that doesn't need to be finished product, that needs to be just free with its processualness, just uninhibited. So the idea of art, that is one thing that we are trying to understand, and this is because of our last 10, 15 years, and also in Sarai, in City Studio, having seen so many artists at play with their various different ways, is that these movements are produced institutionally by curators, by artists themselves in their project. But because of a lack of thinking through the idea of the interstitial is emergent, always an emergent space. You cannot stabilize an interstitial space. That is what my understanding is. Because it is emergent, it needs a certain kind of lightness of presence and understanding and thinking, and then to be able to see what it. But if you see discursively, it is impossible to write on it. Almost nobody would write. Like in JNU, we tried to write with the student a book about that process, about the exhibition. And it was very traumatic for everyone participating to produce a book with an exhibition, with a performance. It became very complicated for the student. But the interesting thing is that process leaves some kind of something to analyze, something to think about. But I will give you an example. We did Sarai Reader 9, which for people who have not, it started in August 2012 and went till April 2013 in Devi Art Foundation. And Devi Art Foundation is a very, very solid building, like it's metal, and it was a very formidable, and it was showing from 2006 onwards, I think, with the opening of Devi Art Foundation in 2006 was covered in International Herald Tribune, in full one page. So it had got a very big international prominence. And then they invited us to do an exhibition. We said, okay, we'll do an exhibition over 9 months. Actually, it became 9 months. Initially, we said 5 months, then it became 9 months because it was rolling very well. And with 100 artists, and I can see so many artists coming out of that process, and it really invigorated a lot of our thinking about art. But what is interesting is that in private conversation, there is a presence of SR9. But if you ask someone to write what exhibitionary history of Delhi, it won't appear. Now, and I remember one now a very established artist, he was there and saying that, my galleries came and this is all a lot of trash here. So what is interesting is that the idea of taste and refinement contains the interstitial, or contains the ability to produce the interstitial. So, and that's one reason why the language of art is always battling against itself. So I think it is very much connected when we produce the language of art, and then how we mobilize it to understand space and understand creativity or understand mutuality, how we work with each other. So I think it will, and if you look at all the curatorial presentations here, they first unpack that language of art in their own way, in their own creative move. Naomi did this beautiful with the black, 6 black marks, drawing the history of Malevich into a completely new geopolitical positioning. So this reworking curator does, but I think we don't do it consciously enough. Now here, when I'm saying we are not as an artist, as a curator, I'm saying to change the term of the artistic space itself. And that's a big burden with us curators you carry. And that burden enacts itself again and again and again with the language of selection, language of exclusion, inclusion. You're continuously burdened with that language, and I think what Naman was saying, the art historical inquiry is about that only. What will you construct at art is a debate, and
yeah. I mean, I feel that one of the things that one tries to do is, for me, the exhibition process, the curatorial process has also been partly, as what Natasha hinted at, as a fact-finding mission, going into all of these places, finding all these unpublished artworks, adding to the canon. And then the actual exhibition inauguration is only the starting point for the process of the research that is going to ensue for years to come. I mean, multiple PhDs have come out of the disturbance to the canon that has happened, because sometimes you're creating an archive, and if you're not doing something as grand as that, you're at least adding to an archive in the process. And so the interstitial model, as it were, what everyone knows, I mean, it's a processual thing, the exhibition itself. And as I was saying day before, I think we make a mistake that we look at the inauguration of the exhibition as the finale of the exhibition rather than as the starting point for inquiry. A lot of research and thinking goes into that launching pad, and then it's the launch. I mean, after that is when everything really starts, post the opening. And rather selfishly, in the lockdown, the data that it has gathered has given me fodder and my students fodder and others as well to work with that material and develop it into all kinds of arenas that it's now taking off in. We didn't have all that, all that information till we collected it. So that's one other way to look at what you asked, perhaps.
The idea of the arena is important, like what is this arena? That the present discomfort with the digital is that this idea of this arena is confused. We are because of this passport size photo of missing the body, like 1/7 of us always visible. It produces this, confuses, but it is an arena in the making, like it is a continuous production of new forms of arenas. And since in contemporary art, we are producing arenas, and it is a production of arenas, and that's why it can look back very interestingly at all forms of art. But theoretically, discursively, the artistic definition is never about an arena. That's why gathering or infrastructure comes much later. So once we alter it, if we can change we have to become the Rahu, of and gobble the time, and then it will become more liberatory. So I think that courage we have to enlist in among ours to gobble the time and then start. So.
There's been a question from one of the audience members, Sujay. If you want to unmute and ask the question yourself to Sasha, and perhaps if other curators want to take this up, the question that you posed about also what is left behind in a city.
Yeah, maybe I can. Yeah, sure. If it is
Welcome to come on video, audio, as you please.
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. No, my question was, more related to the presentation of Yasha, but in a sense, what I was asking is that, this kind of interventions with the city and myself being a part of few of them, one thing is that what happens to the structures that are then built up? What happens to the temporary materials that are produced around the city, around the places of visit? And then what happens when the artists have left? This very traces of production, of this very, debris, whether they turn into debris or they are kind of turned into by others by the citizen of the city for different uses, for different practices, or they just kind of fizzle out. Like I was thinking in terms of Thomas Harshen and in terms of that, but this is something, and whether the curator or the artist really takes the challenge of then again revisiting them, trying to relocate and find what is happening to the structures, and this very entire large process of transformation that happens, because that is when the work kind of moves into another zone, another time zone, another work zone. So this is what I was kind of asking in a sense. Yeah. So any thoughts on that? What happens to those debris? Do we document them? What happens to them, or we leave them as such?
Well, just one, as contemporary artists, we're used to Visarjan. We understand Visarjan. The work, we're very used to the idea that the work won't survive. You grow up like that. So the work, very little of your work would survive. Many of your work won't survive. If you're lucky, if you have some kind of backup of an infrastructure of someone storing it, you're very lucky. Otherwise, it's gone. So from artist's point of view, it is gone. So from the curator's point of view, it is different. And the institution's
sorry, I'm just interrupting. It is not that whether it will survive or not. My question is that what do these debris really become wastes, which has to be then managed somehow? this is more of a question.
I
try. It's a difficult question. I've been talking about the postponed audience, and maybe it goes with the interstitial institution and space. Of course, it's so let's not say really the leftover of an exhibition, because I'm not talking at that level. But of course, what Naman was just saying about the exhibition research knowledge only beginning when it's open, and actually sometimes only beginning when it's closed. You know, when the whole sometimes the exhibition is not a static one, and it's itself unfolding through the course. I mean, like many of the ones of Sarai and Raqs. So I'm trying to think whether we can think of orality objects, whether something really physical like debris does remain, you know, from processes like the exhibition.
Who owns the debris, Zasha?
Sorry?
Who owns that debris?
No, the audience, which includes us, right?
Right. It's the narratives.
Yeah, the narratives, exactly. The oral culture of the exhibition. The orality. So that's why the oral tradition could include material culture. You know, it could include actual physical objects, but what's really being preserved is the narrative and changed, retold. And the postponed audience might be very, very, you know, very late, might come very late, might come, we don't know when it will come always. And we don't know if it's going to be a continued conversation and whether the pickup, I think, Javesh, did you talk about the pickup of?
Yes, on the first day.
Yeah, on the first day. We don't know when that will happen. It's very sad that it doesn't happen. And I was working on a project 2 years ago called Campo Urbano, which was Campo Humano after 50 years. So we picked up a project after 50 years and tried to reconstruct it. And what was interesting about 69 in Italy then was that after every exhibition, there would be an assembly where they would really very agitating, have very difficult discussions, accusatory between the city, the artists, the curators, each really testing each other and maybe creating that oral object. And I think our panel discussions are very polite in comparison to what that assembly with the audience was. And yeah, that's and kind of attempt at an answer.
I'm understanding the question from a different angle, where it's actually related to, I'm taking the reference of the debris and the waste as very literal from the objects and the materiality of this. And I think it's a very important and ethical question that we haven't yet contended with fully as exhibition makers and as curators and people who have been dealing with this material and thinking about that on an ecological level and thinking about this conversation with artists and other cultural practitioners that we work with in the making of these exhibitions. It is a very important question, and I think it's something that we, I don't have it nearly as enough as I wish to, and I think there has to become, I want to say, a call or a veering away from that which is steering the object as much as possible in our conversations. That which is, yes, Sasha, I completely agree. That which is related to the oral or related to the story, there is a perseverance and a lot of things that have their kind of their own hinges to material cultures, but can be much more, to say that it's more ecological or has a sense of responsibility.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that should come at the making stage as well. That kind of ethics of which we try to do a bit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is something that is very important, even in the dialogue that we conduct as curators with our own artists and, you know, with our interlocutors. I think it's very important.
Mohit here. I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think I have a question with Alexandro. He talks about in his presentation speeches in relation with time, and his presentation was somewhere about the future and the Darwin notes and the animal ask. And he also mentioned somewhere the anthropocentric vision within this, looking at the future and the demand of the change. So I'm thinking somewhere, considering this kind of human-centric vision, how can animal can ask something, and if it is asking something, what it can be asked properly. And I think I have a second question to Rux. What would be the practice of discursive justice? And we do see in Delhi, I mean in India, the Shaheen Bagh practice, how kind of collaborated multiple platform, multiple people and practitioners, and how do we relate with them in terms of curation? I don't know, I'm just thinking with them parallelly. Yeah.
I was just I don't know whether you can hear me. Sorry, thanks for the question. At the moment, very much the idea that I mean, if the animals would speak, what would they say? There's a fantastic work by Alora and Calzadilla from a few years ago, which basically is Ted Chiang's story, in which basically there's a kind of actually no, humanity is passing out. If from an alien perspective, if you look at it, would you speak out for an animal? If you could speak, would you speak? Because the humans are doing this to themselves. We'll just sit quiet until the humans have gone. And it's sort of sense of an inversion of a kind of a reality in the hierarchy. And this is where artists are so effective at bringing these metaphorical ideas that cross this in a poignant way. And I forgot the title of the work now, but Alora and Calzadilla's sort of 3-screen installation of works I've been looking at as a way of presenting it. But it's one of these ones where it uses like a fiction story from Ted Chiang as the basis of a kind of, really, would you speak out? Because frankly, look what happened to humanity in this way. And that's a simple way. It's lifting an orientation. It's what Haraway talks about playing with the trouble. It's this idea of complexifying our kind of our role within this, and not centralizing us, but actually making us species interdependent in a way. And that's something that comes through. There's another in the UK, there's a recent book now produced just about fungi and the way that it's called Entangled Life, and this guy called Melvin Sheldrake. But it's just basically showing interdependencies of structures from a biological phenomena of fungi, and the way that we can learn from different species like that. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, he has a very brilliant Insta. Mohit, you can check Melvin Sheldrake in the fungi. He just every day update. About discursive justice, there are two people here. I saw Lantian and Michelle. They're here who have started there. I'll just say discursive justice, very short in terms of a quick line, and I think there is it can be discussed much more, is that it kind of like you have this provincializing Europe. It provincializes the institution of justice to open the question of justice. So what discursive justice in short does is it says that whatever appellate name a justice may call themselves by, like it just provincializes it as one act, and then sees it as a forum in place and sees other sites of forum where the claim to discourse and justice is being continuously recalibrated and changed and made, but not in the known forms of what we call discourse, but discourse itself is being examined. So there is a question, it examines justice, it examines discourse, and provincializes the instruments and the institutions of justice so that, and it calls it the dialect of justice, so that it can play out its full expression everywhere. It can make us examine from materials to human speech to dress, everything. So that's the, and I think there is Shuddha is also there, there is Lantian is also here, Michel is also here. Michel can speak a little bit, Lantian, because the Scheinbach did come up in the reference when they were writing the part of the thing, and so they can speak a little bit. For me, broadly I see it like that, as kind of, if you have to abstract it.
Shuddha, you were saying something?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to respond to this question because I think it's a very fertile question. I'm going to try and do it slightly indirectly by reference first to the exhibition that Naman Ahuja curated, Body in Indian Art. One of the things that really stayed with me from that exhibition was an object, and that, I mean, this is also connected to the previous question of what do you do with debris. There was a brick from one of the Indus Valley civilization sites. It's about 5,000 years ago. It was a very beautiful brick, a rectangle, a solid rectangle. I do not recollect now whether it was clay or stone, but it gave you an idea of a certain mode of thinking about measure and the relationship between bodies dwelling in space. So it created, I mean, and what was interesting in the mediation text was the idea that one of the ways in which we identify all Indus Valley sites is by reference to this particular measure of the brick. Wherever you found a brick of that measure, correct me, Naman, if I'm wrong, there you know that this was an Indus Valley site. So this was a sign, this measure was a sign of a vocabulary of how to build cities. I think a lot of what gets thrown away as debris or produced as art or as cultural manifestations produce systems by which we think about how we organize space and time. And this is my entry point to the question of how do we think about Shaheen Bagh. The moment during which Shaheen Bagh was in process was also a phase that overlapped with a situation that we were quite deeply involved with. Jibesh and Monica referred to it in the first day, which was this 5 million incidents. And there were several of the artists and practitioners in 5 million incidents who were during the day, different parts of the day at the sites in Shaheen Bagh and the other many, there were about 19 other sites in the city which replicated those conditions, and then would come to the Goethe-Institut in Delhi and also produce their whatever they were doing. And now, this was a moment of what in Raqs we call seepage, because clearly there was things that were moving. There was a kind of osmotic flow between the things that they were doing within 5 million incidents and things that they were doing in the public sites of Shaheen Bagh. And I think that the public sites of Shaheen Bagh also sit on top of a certain stratigraphy of processes for the last 7, 8, 10, 12 years in Delhi, where artists have taken on different sort of iterative positions. These are not one-to-one relationships. It's not that what they were doing was causally inflected by what they were doing in one place or by the other. But I tend to think of these as, let's say, the bricks for the future. These will, in time, they will constitute a criterion or a measure for the thinking about what it means to be a citizen. And for me, the most important lesson from Shaheen Bagh was an aesthetic political lesson, which was that the work of citizenship at all times is a work in progress. This is the one distinction that I think that the embodied presence of people in Shaheen Bagh sites made to the efforts of the Citizenship Amendment Act, which seeks to freeze citizenship before a particular date in time. So if you're before 1971 and belong to this or that or the other religion, then you can become a citizen in the future, let's say. That's the basic text of the Citizenship Amendment Act. And I think the instinctive rejection of that mode proposes a different way of thinking about citizenship. But citizenship is a process that is never going to be finished. So in that sense, it's a bit like the brick from the Indus Valley, which will continue to talk about what it means to measure time and space in equal or unequal terms. That's a separate question, but it will create the conditions by which we can say, what does it mean for this or that or the other body to lay a claim to space as someone who can be accounted for, which is what citizenship is. So maybe that understanding that citizenship is a work, is a composition, is something that will be made and unmade and made again, as opposed to something fixed by the letter of the law, proposes a sudden interstice between the aesthetic and the political, where the two overlap and you can't say where aesthetics end and where politics begins. That's how I would answer the Shaheen Bagh question, by looking back at an Indus Valley brick.
In a normal hub situation, everybody would have clapped after this. But
Jibin,
now we have to go.
I just did.
Now we have to
As
quietly listen. Oh, I've missed that after a presentation, little hoo ha ha, like that energy I miss a lot. There's a Zoom produces this meditative silence, and this whole idea of the existential weight of loneliness and isolation that was read by Natasha also adds to that. Are we isolated? Are we lonely? So we can't clap. So
we can snap on our own, but I actually also want to respond to that last comment because I think these questions of citizenship being made and unmade and constantly a work in progress has also exceeded beyond people and humans and borders. And it's really the language in which we're also talking about objects now and belonging. And there's a sense that certain objects need to be inside of certain national borders, inside of certain institutions and so forth and so on. And so I have a little bit of a follow-up question, mostly to Naman, because I also thought that your talk was really provocative in trying to rethink this question of who belongs where. Maybe it's not really a question, but I am also thinking about this sort of legalistic language of belonging and rights and so forth that's been projected onto art objects. And you seem to occupy a very different position in that way. So I was wondering if you could talk about these sort of moves toward reparation and restitution and so forth in that manner.
Right, unmuted myself. Yeah, I think that we need to, the reason I pressed Zasha about this thing about who owns the debris and who owns the narrative is because I'm equally perturbed about the ownership of the knowledge rather than, and the control of the knowledge rather than the control of the material object. The narratives themselves are silenced by the institutions that we are hired by as curators, as audience members. And the narratives have to matter. The narratives, the reason, like I said, in response to what Rohit was asking yesterday, as curators, you're instrumentalized. You are utilized to be able to bring sufficient cool into the institution because it's relevant. But at the same time, there's a boundary, there's that ceiling, and then you're not, and then the narratives beyond that point are never recorded. And if they are, then who owns that and who's going to disseminate it? And that becomes these become very fraught questions for us in our field, because the process cannot be kept going. And I can see that Liuli has raised a very important point as well, that how do we then interrogate history? Because one of the things that I had to contend with in terms of questioning and disturbing these set narratives was that there are so many people whose histories have not been recorded and are being left out. And the measure of those histories is by completely different standards, and they may not come through material artifacts. And you can't get 5,000 voices from 5,000 years ago to fill up oral testimonies and do those, fill a space like that. And so there is that much more onus on the research and the conjecture and the writing that is going to accompany the exhibition. And then that will never see the light of day, because that knowledge sharing platform is not actually safeguarded. And I think we talk as curators about the responsibility and custodianship. And we are coming up with this narrative on the one hand, and we know that custodianship and responsibility, taking care, the curare aspect of the curator, is a very difficult one to fulfill, a very expensive, and it's a limited role, because what we want to do with the object is actually tell the stories around it. And that's more important than the physical possession sometimes of the object. The physical possession of an object and its reparation or restoration or repatriation or whatever it is can be a springboard to that. But are we going to be able to do everything else that comes with it, which I think intellectually at least is more important? So that's my little nuance to the conversation on repatriation, if that clarifies.
Are there other questions from the audience?
Nobina wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Naman was saying just now. Is you spoke about the unequal playing field that exists. So I would like other curators also to reflect from their experiences. What do they feel about this? Like, what do they feel about the current situation where we exhibit things? What Naman is saying is absolutely what I agree to, is who owns what and how do the stories we tell are for whom, like who really relates to them. Like his exhibition was fantastic to look through and understand. So I just wanted the others to reflect on the comment that he'd made about it being an unequal playing field.
No, see this question, where the field is always fluctuating, like the question is that there is no one stable equality, inequality that is being played out. It is continuously modulating and changing depending on what kind of terms, what kind of historical situations suddenly emerge, where you are located. Which like say when we were working in Japan, the working with toxicity and care coming from artists there, it's a completely different narrative. They capture the narrative with an intensity that in India will be very differently captured. Like Amol captures the same narrative with an intensity that another person from another location won't. So equality is something that is permeated in the very act of discourse, narrative, curation, artistic practice. Question is, how do they collide, and what kind of energy that collision produces? I don't think there is any safe space outside. There is no safe space from which anybody is working on. It's not. I don't see it wherever. Like we have worked in many situations. West Asia or Shanghai. I've worked in China, Shanghai, where worked in Japan, and where every place produces its own intense internal inquiry into the way even the language you speak. How you actually talk an artist's biography changes with locations. And that's the intensity of the present, actually. There is no safe, it is not a safe, like you are just, maybe some star curator has the safety of the net, but most of us are trapeze dancers with a lot of holes in the net. And that's the tension. That's what produces the tension and the interest. Let's say it is not compromise or corruption, it is contamination. That is more interesting. I think we're working with extremely working through a contaminated landscape, and contamination as a positive generative field, not something to be wished of. See, while working in Japan, we understood one thing. This, like Indic civilization has a very different way of looking at contamination. It banishes. One of the things in our source book, it banishes. It creates the outcast. It says, I'm not going to touch the toxic. And then it purifies itself and makes a mess of it. And we know how a big mess it has created. But Japan, it is a very different way of dealing with the toxic. And the exhibition then becomes an exploration of toxics in many different ways from many different artistic locations. But that intersection is what a exhibition or exhibitionary process, or like even the discursive justice process does. It opens that inquiry, and it's not a safe space. It's not a safe inquiry. It has to face a lot of inhibitions, a lot of prohibitions, and a lot of self-inquiry. Who said? I think Gitanjali or Zasha said, after an exhibition, you know what you have done. What is the work that is going on, and it's true. Whoever learns cricket, like Bishan Singh Bedi used to say, I understood spin bowling only after many years after I've stopped bowling. You start seeing others. Like when I hear so many of you, I start understanding what is going on in the process that we are in. It's the craft becomes more, what is that play becomes more interesting.
Thanks, Krish. Are there any closing questions? We'd love to take last few questions. There is one.
There are a few, and I think Shuddha was saying something.
Would you like to ask the question yourself? Okay, the question is, in your practice, in your experience as a curator of your many projects, this is to whichever of the panelists would like to answer. Has an existence of audience response or engagement changed your practice substantially? Zasha, Lily, anybody, Dorian, would you like to take this up in terms of an audience response or an audience provocation or engagement with a specific project having substantially changed your practice or your view of that project?
I worked on a project with artists from across the Great Ocean in Australia in 2015 in a regional art gallery a few hours north of Brisbane on the east coast of Australia called Wainu Coconut Water. And it was looking at plantation colonization in that region and the commodification of coconuts as superfoods for Western consumption and this kind of thing. And the exhibition had a lot of artists, 13 artists that some of whom I'd grown up with and others not. But because it was a kind of pan-Pacific, international indigenous exhibition with artists from lots of different cultures, a senior Samoan artist really took me aside at the opening and was like, "You're not doing enough for our people. Like, what are you doing all this stuff for other people?" And I don't know if it really, that kind of critique would really translate to the South Asian context. It's like a sense of you're, betraying the group by working with other communities. and they're very famous artists and going to be even more an international platform that you'll see in the next few years, but I'll keep them nameless. And it was just an interesting kind of moment for me to realize and really clearly define my politics, that I really wanted to be sure to work between communities in an intercultural way, because I'm not only Samoan, I have other heritages too, I'm Francophone, you know, whatever, all these different kind of communities that I belong to and I feel responsible to. So to only choose my own, you know, maternal community when there are erasures of histories that are really important, and I was given a platform to do that. Yeah, so for me it was really important to, that was one moment that didn't play out publicly. Perhaps today, maybe, you know, last year it would have been like a cancel culture kind of thing on Facebook. It was already happening back then, but it didn't happen, thankfully, at that time. The person's mother and my mother are close friends, so that kind of helped us to smooth some of the relationship. But I think, you know, these kinds of moments of redefining or checking in with yourself and making sure that you know what your politics are, and they can change, of course. Yeah, and like 5 years later, I've done a few projects more specifically on Samoan moving image work this year, and trying to create new theoretical terms within the Samoan language, with other knowledge keepers, that, you know, things take their time as well.
There is a comment from Virangana Solanki, curator. She's in a slightly noisy place, but it's just responding to this aspect of care and deep listening, but also the fact that as curators, so much of the work becomes, in a sense, representing the artist's voice and narrating the exhibition as dialogue. So, you know, in that sense, it is also about a translation of ideas and artists' worlds. This is how she's putting it. So how can we perhaps be mindful about this in going forward, the ability to let these voices come through alongside our personal reflections? So how to keep that balance in a sense. And there's, of course, you know, various ways and strategies where artist narrations take precedence to the curator's voice or tone. But perhaps if any of you want to share or reflect on this. Would anyone like to take this up or reflect, or should we move to the next question, which is by Mijay?
Sometimes artists get very angry also with curation. You don't, so it is not voice. Voice is not a voice is not a neutral space. You know, like you may like sometimes you may not like the amplification that it has been given, or sometimes you may not like, you feel it's muted. So it's very complicated. I think Doreen would have something to say.
Why me?
Because you have a lot of curators working with you.
Well, I was actually still thinking about the previous question, which is sort of becoming a kind of a monstrous question, and it's related to what you said, Jibesh, but also, yeah, I don't know where my thinking is. I think I just got stuck. If you don't mind, I just got stuck in my head of what you said earlier about your experience of working in places like Shanghai and Yokohama, and how I read your comments is that the pressure points and the pressures coming from the orthodoxies in different places are slightly different or radically different from one another. And I guess I just feel as somebody who's working on an institution building project that I not only look at my own project, but everything that is happening in many of these major places where this is where real challenges are coming. I guess I was thinking from the first day, something that Naomi also said, even though I don't think that that was the main point of what she was talking about, but it's been very unsettling and disturbing while also edifying to stay, to read about what's happening with, say, Philip Guston retrospective. And all of the politics around it, all of the confused ideologies around it. And I think that what we are, at least in, I don't know, maybe it is just the first world problem. I don't know, but I think what we are experiencing is just bottoms falling out on the assumptions that we didn't have to question for many, many years about what we do as museum workers, what we do as artwork workers, that we all assume that what we are doing, and then the conversations that we're having amongst the colleagues like us, we didn't have to question the fundamental assumptions, but I certainly feel like all those assumptions are now questionable. So the most recent question that is being asked about the relationship between curators and institutions and artists, I think even that, I think, is now deeply questioned. So maybe I can be a little more honest and really say that something that I was referring to in my post-presentation conversation with Natasha, and then I think somebody was also asking questions about like what is the impact of these legislations that are happening in your city, and that's real, and it puts the whole curatorial work, whole institutional work in a very, very difficult place when the moment the legislation goes into effect, that the vast majority of artists, as well as some of your institutional colleagues, sign an open.
I think Dorian's audio video is stuck for now. Natasha?
Right. It'll come back. I think Hong Kong has a cyclical structure.
Is there any other
I just wanted to add, also thinking about the internet connections and how during this pandemic, I have wondered when internet access will be kind of legislated at the international human rights level as a human right, and like similar to universal healthcare and housing and right of assembly, all these kinds of things that we supposedly cherish internationally. The internet in Australia is much worse than my homeland of Samoa because there are 2 fiber optic cables that go through for a population of 200,000 people. But because we have a conservative government here of 23 million people, have just as shoddy internet as everyone else who's coming in today. So I just think, like, can we follow Estonia's example and have kind of like blocks, geopolitical blocks of internet access kind of separate to government, because we can't, rely on corruption. To chuck a spanner in the works there.
That will be a big battle.
I agree with that entirely. Yeah, I hope it becomes a utility, the internet, especially in the land of Mr. Ambani. Over. But while we're waiting for Dorian, I thought I'd also sort of just say something about me Jay's question, which sparked me to think about you know, the age-old debate of aura, right? The aura that surrounds an artwork because of the place in which it is conceived and exhibited, right? And a lot of what, you know, I've learned from the platform is, or from the colloquium is you know, we have a variety of curators who are dealing with civilizations, who are dealing with deconstructing cosmopolitan cities, and Benjamin, you know, his critique often read his essay, the work of art as a celebration of aura, of the pilgrimage that one, you know, used to have to do to go see the Mona Lisa, where it was made, by whom it was made. You know, his big fight with the Frankfurt School and Adorno was about, you know, the fact that he celebrates, in a certain sense, the possibilities of the age of mechanical reproduction, the imminent contradiction of capitalism, and the immense very possibilities it will finally result into. And I saw that very much in the Hong Kong exhibit, in what Zasha was saying about you know, sort of the deconstruction of Puna, you know, of a place by exhibiting within a place in the biennial form, and in what Naman was saying about trying to stage civilizations. And so, yeah, it's a very good question.
Actually, I was going to request Mijay to pose the question, because the audience may not have seen the question. So maybe we let Dorian complete his point, and then we're going to take Mijay as the last question. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, sorry about that. I just ran out of battery on my my laptop. I wasn't being intercepted by some like a higher power or anything like that. Just in case you were wondering. Yeah, no. So like I think I was just saying that I just felt like what we have been experiencing and because it just tends to be really amplified when you are outside of a particular polity, and then listen to via media what is happening in a particular place. It of course gets over dramatized, and then things are really difficult here. But at the same time, I just feel like that the challenges that we're experiencing as an institutional builder is also resonated in so many other places where I think that the ethical and ideological assumptions that we may have held without having to question are all falling out. And then sometimes that actually the solidarity that you also assume with artists and with other cultural workers are also questioned. Because without intending it, that without even knowing how you're getting there, that you suddenly become in diametrically opposed positions as cultural workers and as institutional builders. You find yourself on the other side of what other colleagues in smaller institutions or more, out there in the community who are also with the artists. And I think that's what I really find it very, very challenging these days, and not just where I am, but I also see it in other places as well. I think that was the only point that I was really trying to make. And then even though that wasn't perhaps expressed explicitly by colleagues in the presentations, but that's sort of how I read as well. And that's certainly something I think about a lot in my situation.
Do you feel a pressure of the service provider model that comes into curation of an institutional space of this scale towards a certain group of people who think they own culture or they have a signature over culture?
I think it is both. Yeah, feeling like you're a service provider model. I think saying also in response to one of the questions that was asked about all of the protests and that were happening over the last few years, that that a certain almost perverse need or request that validation is offered, that these expressions, these anti-authoritarian expressions that are being made should be immediately institutionalized. And I find it to be very perverse and very colonial in many ways. So yeah, I mean, service provider, of course we are in many ways, because we're a public institution, we're a publicly funded institution. So there are a whole lot of stakeholders that we have to listen to and also answer to. But at the same time, that the question of what does it mean to be an institution, which is an establishment of the authority of knowledge, and then, but at the same time, do you want it to be naturalized immediately? And I find that relationship to be very, very tricky with the public. Yes.
Yeah, because Naman is here. Just a short thing, one thing, because you have some time in the Zoom. This whole JNU is attacked as a taxpayer. It is coming out of taxpayer money, so it has to follow a certain nationalistic credo. Now, what is interesting is the taxpayer is this new mythical space, which has been dismantled and then mythologized into a political weapon. It has been weaponized. So, and since JNU is a good example of knowledge economies being policed through the language of the taxpayer, it is interesting to hear that in Hong Kong. This
absolutely.
Weaponization of the taxpayer.
Absolutely.
Who in capitalist society is everyone, I guess. Various measures. So I think. So you're curating the taxpayers' money, I guess.
Are you expecting a kind of a response?
A little bit. Last words.
Yeah, I mean, there is a pressure that it's not. I mean, this is just the normal function of propaganda machinery, which is trying to compel you to do something under a democratic rubric, where that idea of the democracy is by those who speak loudest or who are being promoted to speak loudest. So it is allegedly their voice. I mean, the fact of the matter is that getting JNU to toe a line is a bit rich. Frankly speaking, it's pathetic that in a country like India, there is this one JNU, or there are 5 such central universities. There need to be 50. And one in each state of India needs to have a university of the same sort of scale. And it's quite ridiculous that the taxpayer feels as put upon to be funding this one university, when quite frankly, they should be funding many, many more. So, I mean, I really don't see, we all know, I mean, this is a fabrication and this is just a propaganda fabrication. And it continues like that. It's allowed to continue like that. Anyway, that's not what...
Natasha, we have to close now.
I'm finished. There's just, I mean, there's somebody who's been wanting to ask a question for a long time. So I would like to invite that person, Mijay, please, to just ask your question. And let's see for the response, and then we can.
Hi, Jibesh. Hi, Naman. Hi, Natasha. Hi, everybody here. I have been listening to all of you guys for last 3 days, on and off, as in, because I have a toddler, he intervenes in between. But I've been really interested being on the other side of the fence as an artist, as an Indian artist in America. Do you, as curators, since you guys are dealing with the delayed expression of artists through their artworks, Naman, in your case, it can be like a few thousand years, Jibesh, in your case, it could be a few months or several years. And all of you even though it's very closed, it's still in a certain time, which is not the time that you are curating it or putting it on exhibition. Do you guys feel a compulsion to alter the visual language in terms of visual formal presentation? I am not talking of scale here, but do you feel this compulsion to make it stronger, more visually and conceptually appealing to the viewers that you are catering in that time and space? Do you think that that kind of is a difficult task for you guys, or that's a normal mode of modus operandi or something like that? Can you little bit explain on this issue?
Well, in my case, the answer is very simple. I mean, my colleagues all make jokes about this. This is it. I wait for the artist to die before I finish writing a book on them or putting them into a show. And this is a long-standing joke that artist friends have charged me with. But jokes apart, no, I think I'll reverse the question and ask you, since you're an artist. I mean, why do you need a curator? If it is a contemporary show and if you've just done it, you just do your show, right? As an artist, and you have your own shows. So the filtering process that is required, and the question is predicated on this sort of requirement for a curator, right? And that immediately is talking about a level of mediation. That person exists in that interstitial space between the audience or the gallery and the artist for a certain set of purposes that that person is bringing to the table. Because I mean, the standard operating procedure otherwise is artists just have their own shows. I don't know if anyone, I mean, I'm not in the field of contemporary art, so I shouldn't be answering this question.
I'll just add to that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, please.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, I just came from the opening of one of our exhibitions now at the Culture Foundation. That's why I was on the way in the cab. And I have to say, one of my colleagues had curated this show about specifically a very intuitive artist who practices in a myriad of, let's say, languages of painting. And, you know, she played as her own kind of translator, pulling out philosophical strands and interpreted it into her own, you know, very faithful to the artist at the same time. And he was with her, alongside her. I think he was in awe as well in this kind of discursive dialogue that occurred between her way of interpreting, not in a chronological way. And this is spanning a career of like 30 years plus practice. But, you know, it is a dialogue. There is, I want to say, a level of interpretation that happens, and a complicating kind of narrative at the same time that happens. So I see it as an addition, and I've always considered myself as a visual author, being a curator. So, you know, you could add your own, you know, I want to say, metaphors and ways of reading and juxtapositions, even when it's the work of one artist.
I was just going to also add a little bit of maybe an anecdote in relationship to Naman's question, like why would you work with a curator? And I'm thinking of sort of maybe two anecdotes. One is, you know, I went to school at a time when the YBAs were really ascendant in London, and watched them starting to kind of create their own curatorial venues and processes, and kind of thought that was wonderful. And it started to put pressure on what it means for me to do that work. You know, am I necessary? And then the second sort of anecdote I'm thinking of is the fact that in these sort of various shelter at home orders that come down from the city and the state under the pandemic, the exceptions are for essential workers. So if an institution or an organization needs you, you can leave your home and go into the office. But curators are not considered essential workers at museums and institutions, unless they're sort of mounting a show, what have you, but they don't sort of have an automatic right to go into the institution. And I've been sort of laughing at that notion that curators aren't essential workers. And laughing in a good way, because again, it makes me, as Layli says, like you have to kind of codify your politics, codify your position. And for me, that codification has been about really thinking afresh around what I said before about these excessive practices that live outside of just exhibition making, about the dialogue, about these kinds of systems of knowledge exchanges that we've been talking about too. And so being what a former boss of mine, Thelma Golden, calls an active co-conspirator with artists has been really important for me, especially in the contemporary realm.
And since you're asking me, I would say that, philosophically, we are never luminous, in a sense that we don't know everything that constitutes us, all the senses. So there is, so you need a certain infield space, which is what we are called the scenography of luminosity in between people, so that that luminosity can make you aware of a certain degree of your own luminous, like something that is what around you, or that around now is very vast. So for the curatorial becomes a space for that dialogue for an artist who could resist, like with anything, you could be resistant, that you could be with your parents, with your lover, you could be resistant, you could be very, very formidable, you could be great friendship, but it's a scenography. And that scenography, I like, as Naomi or Rem is saying, that scenography is very thick with a certain degree of interpretative, collisionary field, pushing each other. And in that scenography, a lot of other things come, which is also not aware. The curator is also not aware. The curatorial is not also aware. So it's a kind of, that luminous space is what everybody of us, well, artistic practice is kind of, philosophically, you're chasing it. It escapes you, and that's the beauty of it. Otherwise, it's all transaction.
Let's consider it as a love story. I think that's a metaphor that I would think of. It has its turbulence, but it can also, shine somehow.
Yeah, it can, in a sudden moment, shine. It can. Right.
Thank you so much. On these notes, between what it might mean to have the curator as non-essential worker, but also visual author, also someone chasing and capturing luminous moments, and then also seeing them escape and not needing to, as Shudha was saying, it's really staying with the process and keeping what exceeds it for moments in the future. I'd love to conclude on this note and also pass on to Pratik and Priyanka. We have managed to exceed the official time, which is something that always happens at the Hub. But of course, as you all were saying, I mean, the applause and the laughter and the moments of interrupting one another, I mean, those are of course better in the flesh. But really so much gratitude to each of you for sharing anecdotes, for sharing from your practice so generously. We really look forward to your work ahead and wish you so much luck in these times to continue what you do.
Thank you, Natasha. And thank you everybody who's attended and all of our panelists. Really, we talked about, among so many things, what stayed with me is the idea of communitarian models or formats of communitarian care or curatorship. And what better than knowledge sharing, across all sorts of, boundaries and formats and really, so this to me is a gift. So thank you everyone for this gift. Team Experimenters on, and so are our partners, Astrid, Devanjon, Hema, from the British Council, Devanjon, Goethe-Institut, Astrid, and Hema from the Australian Council for the Arts, and Team Experimenter. So you're all here, and we'd love to hear closing words of thanks. And should we all put our mics on and give us all a clap?
Bravo!
Well done. Very well done. Very well done.
Thank you all.
Excellent.
Should we go?
You owe us a beer.
Much more than that.
Okay.
Let's go to Olipop. Let's go to Olipop after this.
Okay, next time. Next time.
Absolutely.
We would love a bit of, I'd love to hear a few words from our partners. Astrid, would you like to go first, please?
Okay, thank you so much. Hello to everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to say a word here at the end of Experimenter Curators Hub. So I've been following it for the last 4 days on and off, and I especially like the discussion at the end. I think it's really great to bring together so many different ideas, views, and approaches on curating, and I think it's a really important platform. And Goethe-Institut is very happy to be partner of it, as we have been in the past years, and I'm very sure that we will continue on this path. So thank you to everybody, to Experimenter, to Pratik and Priyanka Raja, and to Natasha for her great moderation, and to all panelists and the audience, of course, also for the questions. So thanks to everybody. It was really inspiring, very interesting topics and issues, and I'm sure we have to discuss many, many more times to continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Debanton?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Namaskar, everyone. It's a real pleasure for the British Council to be supporting this edition, the 10th anniversary edition of Experimental Curators Hub. The British Council, as some of you may already know, the focus of our work in arts is to support festivals and crafts. But we are also there to create safe space for discussions and dialogues and conversations that might be otherwise difficult. And I think this Experimental Curators Hub is a perfect example which brings together all three of these areas that we focus on, from festivals and crafts and arts to also having these complex, difficult conversations. I would like to thank Priyanka and Pratik in particular for reaching out to us. And we were delighted to support the participation of Alessandro. Thank you, Alessandro. The Baltic is one of my favorite art spaces in the UK, in Gateshead. Newcastle is a very favorite city of mine. And but I would like to just end with a little bit of a personal reflection on a great tragedy that has happened with the Rajas. And when I heard about Dilip Raja's passing away, I was absolutely shocked and deeply saddened. He was someone who I admired personally a lot. And when the 10th anniversary celebrations of Experimenter began last year, I was there at that program at Park Hotel where Bikram Ghosh performed. And I was just reminded of Dilip Das' great participation in that evening. So I really, really greatly grieve and mourn with you, Priyanka and Pratik, Dilip Das passing away. But I'm really full of admiration for your fortitude, your bravery, and your resilience in carrying through with this version of Experimental Curators Hub, despite this great loss. And I think these are values that you must have imbibed from Dilip Das. So thank you very much for doing this. I think he would have really, he is appreciating this wherever he is. Thank you.
Thank you, Debanjan.
Thank you.
Hema?
I'd just like to say a big thank you to Pratik and Priyanka for involving us in the Experimenter Curators Hub, which has become almost a part of our annual calendar at the Australian High Commission at New Delhi and at the Australia Council for the Arts. Luli, it's lovely to have you back, and I attended your session. And I'd just like to thank everybody at Experimenter and all the panelists on behalf of Australia Council for the Arts and the Australian High Commission and the Australian Consulate in Kolkata for such an enriching and thought-provoking conversations over the past 4 days. Thank you and good luck.
On that note of love and warmth, thank you everybody and have a good day. Good night. Bye.
Night.
Bye. Good night. Take care, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you. Stay well.